When a waitress was fired for spending her own money to feed a starving stranger, she thought her life was over. Until the sound of over 100 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roaring down her quiet street shattered the night silence. The leather-clad bikers dismounted with bundles of cash, transforming her from unemployed to fully funded nursing student in a single evening that defied everything she thought she knew about kindness and karma. But what did that hungry stranger really whisper to his brotherhood that mobilized an entire chapter to hunt down one small-town waitress? The fluorescent lights above Mel's diner buzzed like dying wasps, casting their harsh white glow across cracked vinyl booths and a checkerboard floor that had witnessed 40 years of spilled coffee and broken dreams. Outside, the Oregon rain drummed against windows streaked with grease and time, each droplet catching the neon pink of the diner's sign that promised open 24 hours in letters that flickered with the uncertainty of a dying heartbeat. The smell of bacon fat hung thick in the air, mixing with the acrid bite of coffee that had been brewing since yesterday's shift, creating an atmosphere that wrapped around Lynette Morrison like a familiar embrace she both loved and desperately wanted to escape. Her sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as she moved between empty tables, each step echoing in the pre-dawn silence that settled over the diner like a heavy blanket. The radio crackled softly from the kitchen, playing a country song about second chances that made her think of the acceptance letter she'd been too afraid to open. The one sitting on her kitchen counter next to unpaid bills and a photograph of her mother in her old nursing uniform. Lynette's reflection caught in the window as she wiped down the same table for the 4th time, and she paused to study the face staring back at her, 26 years old, but carrying the weight of someone who'd learned too early that dreams cost more than most people could afford. The mason jar hidden behind her apartment's broken radiator contained $237 in crumpled bills and quarters, each coin representing hours spent smiling at truckers who left 50-cent tips and pretended not to notice when her stomach growled during 14-hour shifts. She'd been saving for 3 years now, ever since her mother's diagnosis had derailed her own nursing school plans, forcing her to choose between education and keeping the woman who raised her alive. The jar felt heavier each time she added to it, weighted with the knowledge that it would never be enough, that dreams deferred had a way of becoming dreams denied. The diner held memories in every corner. The booth where she'd first read about nursing programs while eating day-old pie during her break. The register where she'd counted tips with the desperation of someone trying to make pennies add up to possibilities. The coffee machine that had become her confidant during those long nights when the only customers were insomniacs and truck drivers carrying cargo across state lines she'd never crossed. The walls wore decades of cigarette smoke like yellowed wallpaper, and the ceiling tiles sagged with the weight of conversations about lost loves and found fortunes, about highways that led somewhere better and jobs that paid enough to matter. Her uniform hung on her thin frame like borrowed clothes, the polyester fabric scratching against skin that had grown sensitive to the touch of anything that reminded her of servitude disguised as employment. The name tag read Lynette in faded block letters, but she'd started thinking of herself as just another piece of diner equipment, something that poured coffee and cleared tables and absorbed the casual cruelty of customers who saw service workers as extensions of the machines they operated, rather than people with dreams that extended beyond refilling sugar dispensers and memorizing breakfast specials. The bell above the door chimed at 4:17 in the morning, its brass voice cutting through the silence like a prayer answered too late. A figure stumbled through the doorway, leather jacket hanging off his frame like borrowed skin, water streaming from dark hair that hadn't seen a barber's attention in months. His boots left wet prints across the floor as he made his way to the counter, each step deliberate and measured, as if walking required more concentration than most people realized. Lynette could smell the rain on him, mixed with motor oil and something else, the particular scent of someone who'd been riding highways with no destination in mind, chasing horizons that always seemed to recede just beyond the reach of headlights and hope. The fluorescent light revealed the geography of his face, lines carved by wind and weather, eyes that held stories of truck stops and roadside motels, hands that knew the weight of handlebars and the vibration of engines that had carried him across distances most people only experienced through airplane windows. His leather jacket bore patches from places that sounded like mythology to someone who'd never left Oregon: Sturgis, Daytona, Route 66, each one a badge of membership in a brotherhood she'd only glimpsed through diner windows when groups of riders stopped for coffee and left tips that suggested they understood what it meant to live paycheck to paycheck. "Just coffee, please," he said, his voice carrying the roughness of too many cigarettes and not enough sleep, hands emerging from jacket pockets to reveal fingernails embedded with engine grease and palms mapped with old scars that spoke of mechanical intimacy and highway accidents survived through skill and luck in equal measure. He counted out quarters and dimes on the formica surface, the coins making small clicking sounds that seemed to echo louder than they should in the empty space, each piece of silver and copper carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to measure wealth in increments small enough to fit in palm-sized handfuls. 37, 42, 55 cents. Lynette watched him count twice, then a third time, his jaw tightening with each realization that the numbers wouldn't change no matter how many times he rearranged them, that mathematics remained immune to wishful thinking and desperate hope. The coffee maker gurgled behind her, a sound like contentment that filled the silence while she studied his face in the fluorescent light, recognizing something in his expression that transcended the space between stranger and friend, the particular emptiness that came from choosing pride over asking for help, from riding through nights that stretched longer than gas tanks allowed. She'd seen that look in her own reflection during the months after her mother's first hospitalization, when medical bills had devoured her savings and left her choosing between textbooks and groceries, between her own future and her mother's present, between dreams that felt selfish and responsibilities that felt crushing. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, the understanding that suffering created a language that transcended words, that need spoke to need in frequencies only the desperate could hear. 30 cents short, he said, more to himself than to her, his voice barely above a whisper as he stared at the coins scattered across the counter, each one representing hours of work at jobs that paid too little to matter but too much to quit. His shoulders sagged with the weight of defeat, and Lynette felt something twist in her chest, a recognition that penetrated deeper than sympathy and approached the realm of spiritual connection. Without thinking, her hand moved to the register, her fingers finding the quarters she'd earned from the last customer's tip, adding them to his collection until the numbers finally made sense, until mercy overcame calculation and the universe briefly balanced its books in favor of kindness. "There you go," she said, sliding the steaming cup across the counter, along with a plate of day-old apple pie that would have gone in the garbage anyway, watching as surprise flickered across his weathered features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds that had been gathering for longer than either of them could remember. He looked up at her then, really looked, and she saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the armor that let gratitude bleed through like light through stained glass windows, transforming ordinary moments into the sacred. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than 30 cents should have been able to support, containing within them the acknowledgement that kindness, when least expected, felt like miracle disguised as coincidence, like grace disguised as chance. The morning shift supervisor arrived at 7:30 sharp, his polyester uniform pressed to military precision and his clipboard clutched like a weapon against the chaos of human kindness that threatened to undermine the careful mathematics of profit margins and corporate efficiency. Dale Morrison, no relation, despite sharing her last name, had the particular cruelty that came from small authority exercised over smaller people, his eyes scanning register receipts with the dedication of an accountant hunting for discrepancies that might justify his existence in a universe that seemed designed to minimize the importance of men who measured their worth in other people's mistakes. The coffee pot sat half empty. The pie case showed one missing slice, and the register showed a payment 30 cents less than the inventory demanded, creating a mathematical puzzle that Dale approached with the enthusiasm of a detective who'd finally discovered evidence of the crime he'd always suspected was being committed under his watch. His fingers moved across the keys of his calculator with mechanical precision, each number confirming what he'd hoped to find, proof that compassion was nothing more than theft disguised as virtue, that kindness was a luxury that working people couldn't afford to practice on company time with company property. The morning rush had begun in earnest, truckers and early commuters filling the booths with the sounds of conversations about weather and traffic, their voices mixing with the sizzle of eggs on the griddle and the hiss of coffee machines that worked overtime to fuel a world that ran on caffeine and the promise of better days ahead. Lynette moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind wandered to the mason jar at home and the acceptance letter that waited like a time bomb, filled with either salvation or the final confirmation that some dreams cost more than working people could afford to pay. "Lynette!" Dale called from behind the counter, his voice cutting through the morning bustle like a blade designed specifically for her throat, sharp enough to slice through the protective numbness she'd built around herself during years of service industry employment. She felt her stomach drop even before she turned around, recognizing the tone that preceded unemployment, the way sailors recognize the sound of approaching storms, the particular frequency that management used when they had decided that human resources had become more expensive than human replacement. The pie plate sat in the bus tub, still bearing crumbs and the ghost of kindness that would cost her everything she'd been working toward. Evidence of a crime that had felt like righteousness in the moment, but looked like stupidity in the harsh light of corporate accountability. Dale held up the receipt like a prosecutor, presenting evidence to a jury that had already reached its verdict, his face flushing red as brake lights with the particular anger of someone who'd never missed a meal, criticizing someone who'd chosen compassion over policy, mercy over mathematics. "You want to explain this discrepancy?" he asked, though his tone suggested that explanations were formalities rather than opportunities for understanding. That the trial had concluded before it began, and the only question remaining was whether the execution would be public or private. The other customers continued their conversations, unaware that her future hung in the balance of 30 cents and a slice of day-old pie, their laughter mixing with the sounds of a world that functioned according to rules she'd temporarily forgotten in a moment of momentary weakness. "There was a customer who was short on change," she began, but Dale's raised hand cut her off before she could explain about hollow eyes and rain-soaked leather, about recognition that transcended the space between stranger and friend, about the mathematics of mercy that operated according to principles that couldn't be reduced to profit and loss statements. His gesture carried the authority of someone who'd learned that power came from the ability to silence others rather than the wisdom to listen. That management meant making examples rather than making exceptions. "Company policy is clear, Lynette," he said, each word delivered with the precision of someone who'd memorized the employee handbook and treated it as scripture rather than suggestion. "No freebies, no exceptions, no bleeding heart charity work on company time with company property. This isn't a soup kitchen, it's a business, and businesses that give away inventory don't stay in business long enough to provide employment for people who seem to think kindness pays the bills." His words hit like physical blows, each syllable designed to reduce her act of kindness to theft, to transform compassion into criminal behavior that justified what came next. The uniform felt heavier as she untied her apron, her hands shaking slightly as she folded it and placed it on the counter next to the register that had recorded her final act of defiance against a system that measured success in dollars rather than dignity, efficiency rather than empathy. 40 hours a week for 2 years, countless double shifts and holidays spent serving coffee to strangers, while her own dreams grew cold in mason jars and unopened letters, all erased by 30 cents, and the audacity to choose humanity over profit margins, grace over greed. "Clean out your locker," Dale said, already turning away to address the morning rush as if she'd never existed. As if her absence wouldn't leave a gap in the universe that someone else would have to fill, someone who might not understand that service meant more than just delivering food and coffee, that it sometimes required delivering hope through small acts of kindness that cost almost nothing but meant everything to people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as human rather than customer, person rather than transaction. The walk home stretched longer than usual, each block carrying the weight of unemployment and uncertain futures. Past the community college where her dreams lived in catalog pages and course descriptions she'd memorized but never experienced. Past the pharmacy where her mother picked up medications they could barely afford even when Lynette had been employed. The acceptance letter sat on her kitchen counter where she'd left it that morning, next to bills she couldn't pay and the photograph of her mother in whites that had once seemed like a promise rather than a taunt. Evidence of possibilities that had been within reach before 30 cents had transformed kindness into unemployment. Her mother's voice echoed from the bedroom, weaker now than it had been 6 months ago, calling out medication reminders and doctor's appointments that cost more than most people's rent. Each prescription a reminder that healthcare was a luxury that poor people purchased with their futures rather than their present comfort. "How was work, baby?" she asked when Lynette appeared in the doorway, and the question hit harder than Dale's criticism, carrying the weight of expectations and sacrifices that stretched back through generations of women who'd chosen other people's needs over their own dreams, who'd learned to measure success in survival rather than satisfaction. "Fine, Mama." "Just fine," Lynette said, the lie tasting like copper pennies and broken promises, like the flavor of words that protected other people from truths they couldn't afford to hear. The afternoon sun filtered through thin curtains, casting shadows across medical bills and past due notices that covered the kitchen table, like evidence of a life lived paycheck to paycheck, always one emergency away from complete disaster, one act of kindness away from unemployment, one moment of human decency away from financial ruin. The mason jar felt impossibly light in her hands as she counted the contents again. $237 that had seemed like progress until unemployment transformed it into a few weeks' worth of survival, nothing more. Each bill represented hours of her life, traded for wages that barely covered basic existence, dreams deferred in favor of rent payments, and grocery bills that stretched food stamps and dignity to their breaking points. The acceptance letter remained unopened, its edges growing soft from handling, containing either salvation or the final confirmation that some dreams required more than determination and sacrifice, that they demanded luck and timing and circumstances that aligned like planets in configurations too rare to count on. Evening brought the sound of her neighbors returning from jobs that still existed, car doors slamming and dinner preparations beginning in kitchens where people didn't have to choose between kindness and survival, between conscience and employment, between doing what felt right and doing what paid the bills. Lynette sat on her front porch steps, watching the streetlights flicker to life one by one, each bulb pushing back darkness while she contemplated how to explain losing another job to a woman who'd already sacrificed too much for her daughter's abandoned dreams, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse until her body broke down and her daughter had to choose between education and keeping her alive. The air smelled like rain again, promising another storm that would wash the streets clean while leaving everything else exactly as broken as before. She thought about the stranger with hollow eyes and rain-soaked leather, wondered if he'd found a warm place to sleep, or if 30 cents worth of kindness had made any difference at all in a world that seemed designed to punish people for caring. Hours passed in this reverie until something changed in the evening air, a sound that started as something felt rather than heard. A vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself and travel through the concrete steps where Lynette sat with her head in her hands, trying to find words that could transform unemployment into hope for a woman who'd already given too much of her life to other people's needs and deserved better than watching her daughter fail at the same dreams she'd been forced to abandon. At first she thought it might be thunder, the kind that rolled across Oregon's valleys without warning, but thunder didn't build with such mechanical precision, didn't carry the rhythmic pulse of pistons and chrome that grew louder with each passing second, transforming the quiet suburban evening into destiny, approaching unexpectedly. The vibration traveled up through the porch boards and into her bones, a frequency that made the windows of her small rental house hum like tuning forks struck by an invisible hand, each pane of glass responding to the approaching mechanical symphony with tremors that suggested the universe itself was preparing for something unprecedented. Her neighbor's porch light flickered on across the street, then another and another, as the sound swelled beyond the possibility of coincidence or weather, becoming a force that demanded attention from everyone within a 5-mile radius, pulling people from their evening routines and television programs and dinner preparations to witness whatever approached through the darkness like a river of chrome and possibility. Car alarms began their electronic screaming, triggered by the bass notes of whatever approached through the night, their high-pitched warnings mixing with the deeper rumble to create a symphony of mechanical chaos that had never been heard on this quiet Oregon street before, transforming the quiet residential neighborhood into the epicenter of an event that would be remembered long after the sound faded and the participants returned to their ordinary lives. Lynette stood slowly, her hand gripping the porch railing as the sound resolved itself into something recognizable yet impossible, the synchronized roar of motorcycle engines, not one or two, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all moving with the unified purpose of a mechanical army that had materialized from highways and truck stops and roadside diners across a continent she'd only imagined. The first headlight appeared at the end of her street like a fallen star, bright white cutting through the darkness with surgical precision, followed by another, then 10 more. Then too many to count as the convoy rounded the corner and began the slow procession down her quiet residential block, with the solemnity of a funeral cortege or a victory parade, impossible to distinguish between the two in the surreal light of street lamps that had never illuminated anything more dramatic than teenagers sneaking past curfew or neighbors retrieving mail from boxes that contained bills rather than miracles. Chrome and steel gleamed under the streetlights, each motorcycle a work of art and engineering that spoke of highways conquered and distances that most people only experienced through airplane windows. Machines that had carried their riders across state lines and time zones and geographical boundaries that separated dreams from reality, hope from despair, kindness from consequence. The riders sat tall in their saddles, leather vests bearing patches and colors that told stories of brotherhood, forged in roadside diners and desert highways, their faces serious beneath helmets that reflected the streetlights like mirrors designed to blind angels or reveal devils, depending on perspective and prejudice and preconceptions about people who chose freedom over security, movement over stability. Mrs. Henderson from next door emerged onto her porch in her bathrobe, clutching her small dog against her chest, as if the approaching motorcycles might devour pets along with the peace and quiet of suburbia. Her face a mixture of fear and fascination, as she witnessed a scene that belonged in movies rather than the space between her manicured lawn and the sidewalk where children drew hopscotch squares with chalk that would wash away in the next rain. Children pressed their faces against bedroom windows, eyes wide with the kind of wonder that came from witnessing something that transcended their experience of Saturday morning cartoons and video games. Something real and immediate and overwhelming in its implications for how the world actually worked versus how they had been taught it was supposed to work. The convoy continued its approach with funeral solemnity, each rider maintaining perfect formation as if they had rehearsed this moment for years, waiting for the precise combination of circumstances that would justify such an overwhelming display of solidarity. Such a massive mobilization of mechanical power and human brotherhood in service of principles that couldn't be measured in dollars or reduced to statistics or explained through conventional wisdom about cause and effect, action and reaction, kindness and consequence. Lynette's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized something in the lead rider's posture, the particular way he held his shoulders that reminded her of rain-soaked leather and hollow eyes that had counted coins across a Formica counter just that morning, transforming a stranger she'd met that very morning into something approaching destiny. A 4 a.m. encounter into the first movement of a symphony that was only now, later that evening, reaching its crescendo. The motorcycle engines throttled down to an idle that still shook the ground beneath her feet, creating a mechanical purr that sounded like barely contained thunder, waiting for permission to explode into sound and fury, like the heartbeat of some massive creature that lived on highways and fed on asphalt. The lead rider removed his helmet slowly, revealing weathered features that had seen more highways than most people saw, city blocks, his gray hair catching the streetlight as he dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered every mile they'd traveled, every road they'd conquered, every sunrise they'd witnessed from the seat of a machine that transformed solitude into freedom, isolation into choice. His boots hit the asphalt with the solid sound of someone who'd learned to walk on shifting ground, who'd found stability in movement and security in the brotherhood of people, who understood that sometimes the journey mattered more than the destination, that sometimes the road itself was home. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying across the space between street and porch with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard over engine noise and highway wind. Someone who'd learned to project meaning across distances that swallowed ordinary conversations and reduced small talk to meaningless noise. Behind him, the other riders began dismounting in synchronized waves, their boots hitting asphalt with the precision of soldiers taking position for a battle that would be won with generosity and kindness, with the kind of overwhelming display of human decency that transformed cynicism into wonder and despair into hope. "We heard what happened to you today," he continued, walking toward her porch with slow, deliberate steps that gave weight to each word, each gesture designed to convey respect rather than intimidation. "Name's Jake. That was my brother you helped this morning." The sight of him triggered a memory cascade that left Lynette breathless. The way he'd counted those coins, the defeat in his shoulders, the gratitude that had flickered across his features when 30 cents had transformed into possibility, when kindness had briefly aligned the universe in favor of mercy over mathematics. But now those same features carried determination instead of desperation, purpose instead of resignation, as if her small act of kindness had traveled through some underground network of motorcycle riders and emerged transformed into something that defied every assumption she'd ever made about cause and effect, about the relationship between giving and receiving, about the mathematics of grace that operated according to principles that couldn't be reduced to profit and loss statements or explained through conventional wisdom about human nature and the supposed futility of expecting goodness to be rewarded with anything other than exploitation and disappointment. "Nobody should lose their job for showing kindness," another rider said, stepping forward from the crowd with a bundle of $20 bills that caught the porch light like green fire, like currency that had been blessed by miles and brotherhood, and the understanding that money meant nothing unless it could be transformed into freedom, into possibility, into the kind of gift that changed lives rather than just bank balances. His vest bore patches from states she'd only seen on maps: Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, each one representing miles of road and stories of brotherhood that extended beyond family ties or geographical boundaries, beyond the conventional definitions of loyalty and responsibility that bound most people to places and people they'd never chosen. More riders approached, their saddlebags yielding envelopes and handfuls of crumpled bills, quarters and dimes mixed with 50s and hundreds. As if every toll booth and truck stop between here and the Atlantic Ocean had contributed to this moment. The money kept coming in waves that defied logic, passed from gloved hand to gloved hand, through a crowd that stretched farther than the streetlights could illuminate, each contribution representing not just financial support, but membership in a family defined by choice rather than circumstance, by acts of kindness rather than accidents of birth. The convoy prepared for departure with the same ceremonial precision that had marked their arrival, each rider checking their machine with the ritualistic care of people who understood that the road demanded respect and preparation in equal measure, that highways were sacred spaces where carelessness could transform adventure into tragedy, where mechanical failure could strand brotherhood in places where cell phones had no signal and help came only from other riders who understood the unspoken obligations that bound people who'd chosen freedom over security, movement over stability. Engines coughed to life one by one, creating a rolling thunder that built from whisper to roar as over 100 motorcycles synchronized their mechanical heartbeats into a single, overwhelming pulse that seemed to shake loose every star in the Oregon sky, transforming the quiet suburban street into a launch pad for dreams that had been grounded too long by practical considerations and financial limitations. Lynette stood on her porch holding enough money to transform impossibility into inevitability. Bills and coins that represented more than currency. They carried the accumulated kindness of strangers who'd become family through shared understanding of what it meant to live on the margins, to choose compassion over comfort, to measure wealth in freedom rather than possessions, to find home in movement rather than mortgages. The weight of the money in her hands felt like responsibility disguised as gift, like proof that the universe operated according to principles that couldn't be taught in economics classes. The lead rider paused at the end of her walkway, his weathered features soft with gratitude that approached reverence, as if he understood that this moment represented more than financial rescue. It was proof that kindness, once released into the world, multiplied in ways that defied every economic principle ever written in textbooks she couldn't afford. That compassion generated returns that couldn't be calculated through conventional mathematics, but could be felt in the weight of money that smelled like gasoline and freedom, in the sight of Brotherhood that had materialized from highways and truck stops to deliver justice through generosity. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples," he said, his voice carrying over the rumbling engines with the weight of someone who'd learned this lesson through thousands of miles and countless encounters with strangers who'd become family through shared moments of grace, through roadside assistance that extended beyond mechanical problems, to include emotional support, financial help, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be purchased but only earned through years, of proving that Brotherhood meant more than just wearing the same colors or riding the same brand of machine. His hand touched his heart in a gesture that spoke of honor, earned rather than demanded, respect given rather than taken. Acknowledgement that transcended words and approached the realm of ceremony, of ritual, of sacred obligation between people who understood that some debts could never be repaid in conventional currency, but only through the commitment to pass kindness forward, to transform receiving into giving, to ensure that grace continued flowing through a world that seemed designed to reward cruelty and punish compassion. Lynette felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her 30 cents had somehow purchased something infinitely more valuable than coffee and pie. It had bought her a place in a brotherhood that measured wealth in compassion rather than currency, in miles shared rather than dollars hoarded, in the willingness to ride through darkness, to deliver light to people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as family rather than stranger, person rather than transaction. The other riders followed suit, each one touching their hearts in acknowledgement before mounting their machines, their movements creating a ceremony that felt ancient despite the modern chrome and steel beneath them, like knights preparing for quests that would be measured in kindness delivered, in bridges built, in hope distributed. The ritual spoke of traditions that predated highways and motorcycles, of brotherhood that transcended technology and geographical boundaries, of loyalty that couldn't be manufactured but only cultivated through years of proving that some people could be trusted with vulnerability, that some strangers deserved to become family, that some acts of kindness deserved to be remembered and repaid in ways that transformed recipients into participants in an ongoing circle of grace. The sound of their departure built slowly, like an orchestra tuning instruments before the performance that would define their legacy. Engines warming from idle to purr to roar as the convoy began its exodus from Maple Street back toward distant highways, carrying stories that would be told in truck stops and roadside diners from coast to coast, adding another chapter to the mythology of brotherhood that bound people who'd chosen to live outside conventional definitions of success and security, who'd found family and movement and home in the spaces between destinations. Mrs. Henderson waved from her porch, her dog no longer trembling in her arms, as if she'd realized that this invasion had brought blessing instead of chaos, transformation instead of disruption, proof that the world contained more goodness than the evening news suggested, more kindness than cynicism allowed, more hope than practical experience seemed to justify. Children pressed harder against bedroom windows, committing to memory the sight of over 100 motorcycles flowing like a metallic river through their neighborhood, carrying stories they'd tell for the rest of their lives about the night when fairy tales materialized on Maple Street in the form of motorcycle riders, when justice arrived wearing leather vests and riding machines that transformed highways into arteries of grace flowing between hearts that had learned to measure wealth in kindness rather than currency. Lynette remained on her porch long after the last taillight had disappeared around the corner, long after the sound of engines had faded into the background hum of late-night traffic and distant trains. Holding the acceptance letter that had finally been opened to reveal what she'd known all along, that she'd been accepted into the nursing program that would transform her from someone who served coffee to someone who served healing, from someone who cleaned tables to someone who cleaned wounds, from someone who took orders to someone who gave hope to people who'd forgotten what it felt like to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The money in her hands represented more than tuition and textbooks. It represented proof that compassion was the only currency that appreciated rather than depreciated, the only investment that guaranteed returns beyond calculation, the only wealth that multiplied when shared rather than diminished. Each bill carried the fingerprints of strangers who'd become family through her act of kindness. Each coin represented miles traveled by people who understood That home wasn't a place, but a feeling. That family wasn't biology, but choice. That love could be expressed through the willingness to ride hundreds of miles to deliver justice through generosity to someone who'd lost her job for choosing mercy over mathematics. Her mother appeared in the doorway behind her, wrapped in the old quilt that had covered 3 generations of women who'd learned that strength came not from taking, but from giving. Not from hoarding, but from sharing whatever little they had with those who had even less. Not from building walls, but from constructing bridges that allowed grace to flow freely between hearts that had learned to recognize suffering in all its forms and respond with kindness rather than judgment, compassion rather than condemnation. "What was all that noise, baby?" she asked, her voice carrying the weakness that medication couldn't quite disguise. But her eyes bright with curiosity about the mechanical thunder that had shaken their small house like an earthquake designed by angels, like the footsteps of miracles walking through suburbia, like the sound of destiny arriving. "Just some friends stopping by," Lynette said, helping her mother to the porch swing where they could watch the stars emerge through the city's glow. Each point of light a reminder that the universe was vast enough to contain both suffering and salvation, both loneliness and the kind of brotherhood that materialized when least expected, but most needed. Both cruelty and the overwhelming kindness that could transform 30 cents into transformation, unemployment into opportunity, despair into the kind of hope that felt solid enough to build dreams upon. The nursing uniform in the old photograph suddenly seemed less like a ghost of abandoned dreams, and more like a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled, white fabric that would soon wrap around her own shoulders as she learned to heal others the way strangers on motorcycles had healed her, as she discovered that caring for people was more than just delivering food and coffee. That healing meant more than just bandaging wounds. That nursing was really about recognizing the humanity in everyone who crossed her path, and responding with the kind of kindness that transforms strangers into family, patience into people, work into calling. The night air smelled like rain and motor oil and new possibilities, carrying the promise that sometimes the universe rewarded those brave enough to lead with their hearts. Lynette looked down at the money in her hands, then up at the stars that had witnessed her transformation from unemployed waitress to future nurse, finally understanding that her dream of healing others had begun the moment she'd chosen to heal a stranger's hunger. And that kindness, once shared, created ripples that would touch lives in ways that would never be fully known, but would always be completely felt.